To understand the founding of Oxford and Cambridge, we need to understand what universities were like and what universities were at the intersection of the early Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. In that period, the concept of a university was just evolving, and it was very different than what we think of as a university today. Before the first universities, people were either taught at monastic schools, typically based in rural monasteries, or by wandering scholars who would basically set up lectures and you would go to those lectures and learn something. It is this second method, the wandering scholar method, that really gave rise to what we consider a university today. And this method worked great until you begun to get large numbers of wandering scholars based in the same city. When you had maybe 10 or 20 wandering scholars all in one city, all competing with each other for students, you begun to run into problems. And things like guilds began to form amongst these wandering scholars and their students. These guildish university things were primarily meant to reduce competition amongst the professors and, more importantly, help protect the students and the professors from the local town. Now, while these new universities, or proto-universities, vastly reduced the amount of competition between these wandering scholars, they were still in a much more precarious position than today's university professors. For example, at the University of Bologna, one of the early universities, students would vote on how much they would pay their professors. And the professors weren't allowed to negotiate with the students. The professor had to leave the room and choose a student to negotiate their salary with the other students. And so that student would stand up and try and negotiate the highest price for them. But remember that they would also be paying the salary, so they wouldn't have a huge motivation to negotiate a great salary for this professor. It's important to note here as well that while there were internal factors, such as wanting to protect yourself from the local population and wanting to reduce competition that caused the creation of these early universities, there were also external factors. For example, the church did a lot to encourage their creation because it made it easier to monitor what was being taught in local towns. It's much easier to, tell a university you're teaching heretical stuff than it is to hunt down every one of the individual wandering scholars in a town and tell them you're teaching heretical stuff. The University of Oxford was founded as one of these proto-universities. That's why if you try and find a founding date for Oxford, they'll say, well, there is records of people teaching in the town of Oxford that go back as far as 1096. But it's hard to find an exact start date for the university because the change from a town where a lot of wandering scholars congregated to a actual university is sort of a fine line and a nebulous line. So the best we can say is, when were people first teaching in this town? All that said, Oxford really didn't reach critical mass to become what we might consider the beginnings of what it is today until Henry II banned English students from studying in France in the University of Paris, for obvious reasons, in 1167, which caused sort of a rapid expansion in the size of Oxford as a university. Now, before I can get into why Cambridge was founded as a university, it's important to understand how the university system helped protect students and professors from the towns themselves. Before these guild-like universities existed, when every student and professor was an individual actor, they made easy prey for unscrupulous townfolks. They were these rich dandies coming into town who didn't really understand the local dialect and may not even speak the local language. You could basically charge them whatever you wanted, or do any other number of abusive practices to them and get away with it because they were very much outsiders. When the students and wandering scholars banded together into these sort of early guild-like universities, they gained power over the town. Because unlike modern universities, they didn't own buildings, they would rent space. They didn't own dorms, they would rent space. And if a town ever really became abusive or the local civil authorities didn't do what this new Guildlike University wanted them to do, they could just pick up and move to another town, which would really damage the local economy, especially once these student bodies began to bring in significant income to the local economy. So now, universities had the upper hand in the town and university conflict. But the deck was about to be stacked overwhelmingly in their favor. When the church got involved in wanting to encourage setting up these universities so that they could better monitor what was being taught, students became officially clerics, which meant students were tried in clerical courts and not civil courts. Clerical courts were the courts where deacons and bishops and priests were tried. Now, what makes students different from all these other people who are tried in clerical courts? Well, students could fornicate, and students could drink, and students were, well, college students. And now all of a sudden, they're being tried in courts that don't have, the death penalty, that aren't chopping off their hands in retribution for things, and that are of their dandy peers, not the local population. All of a sudden, the local population could no longer really try and punish students for their wrongdoing. And even worse than that, now students are considered clerics, which means that if you were to fight back against a student, suppose a student was to walk up to you and begin pushing you, really drunk, like, hey, what's up, mate? If you hit them back, you could be excommunicated. And as you can imagine, this led to rather abusive behavior on behalf of the students towards the town folks. They now could not be punished back, and they held the town's purse strings. As you can imagine, this was a societal powder keg. Town-gown relations were at a historic all-time low throughout the High Middle Ages. And this powder keg would erupt frequently, and you'd get fallout, and the university would leave. But in one particularly noticeable example for our story, in Oxford, a couple students murdered a woman. Now, if they had been tried in the clerical court like they were supposed to be tried, they couldn't have gotten the death penalty. And the town was not really okay with this. Basically, they'd had enough of being pushed around, and they tried them in the civil courts, and they were hung. And the university was very upset. And so the university, like they had done in the past, went on strike. They went to other cities to begin setting up their teaching. Some went to the University of Paris. Some set up a small teaching thing in reading, and the majority went to a town called Cambridge. To the individuals doing this, this was a typical strike. This was something universities throughout the High Middle Ages did. But when we look back on it from a historic perspective, we say this is the founding of the University of Cambridge. And in a way it was. They would have immediately started calling themselves the University of Cambridge because in the High Middle Ages, universities were always named after the city they were based in. Whether it's the University of Paris, the University of Bologna, the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, the University of St. Andrews, the University of Edinburgh, you would always name the university after the town it was based in, so they would have immediately started calling themselves the University of Cambridge. But they would not have seen themselves as being a different organization than the university that used to be set up in Oxford. Now, I couldn't find out why this happened, but in this particular instance, this particular one instance in the High Middle Ages, the university never went off strike, or at least a large portion of the university never went off strike, and I also can't find out how large a portion of the university never went off strike. But when it was time to return to Oxford, a number of students and professors decided they didn't want to. And I can't find out whether it was a majority or just a few, but enough of them decided to stay in Cambridge that you had the beginnings of the University of Cambridge, while the rest went back to Oxford and continued with the tradition of the University of Oxford. Now, Cambridge was really solidified as a separate institution when it got its charter from the Crown in 1231. Oxford didn't get its charter until 1248, and so many individuals from Cambridge will use this to say that Cambridge was founded before Oxford and is the older university. When in reality, to say that either Cambridge or Oxford is the older university is sort of a pointless claim. They were both really founded as the same university, which split into two universities, but have traditions that are equally old and stem from this one tradition in the High Middle Ages. As always, the links are below. I'm actually thinking about doing some more of these sort of bite-sized documentaries. Specifically, I'd love to do one on the founding of Johns Hopkins, which is just a fascinating tale. So if you guys like this, please subscribe, and I will try and produce more content like this.